Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Good Life Podcast. This is Matt Carpenter, and I'm pleased today to introduce to you Mr. Timon Cline. Timon is an author. He is a lawyer. He's an attorney who works in New Jersey, graduated from Rutgers Law School, from Westminster Theological Seminary, and he also is a part of a group called the Craig Center for the Westminster Standards at Westminster. So, Timon, thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matt.
So, Timon has written a good bit about the Puritans, and they are an interesting topic. That there's a lot of both information and misinformation about them. So, just to start out with, Timon, what is it that really stirred your interest initially in the New England Puritans? And feel free to start before New England if you would like, but just what is it that started your interest there?
Yeah, no, and it is the New England Puritans that sparked my interest initially. So it is that particular group of Puritans, which, of course, to understand them well, you have to understand not only their background in Old England, but also their interaction with Old England that continues. Francis Bremer is a really good Puritan scholar, has some good works showing that they were never isolated once they came to New England intellectually or in terms of communication. So there's a lot of transatlantic friendship. I think he would kind of phrase it that way. And they remain very attached and interested politically in what's going on back home. So it is a whole group, but the New England style or the New England instantiation of Puritanism is what first got me interested. And it was reading, probably maybe close to 10 years ago. I'm not sure how long it was, but reading Perry Miller's 2 volumes, the New England Mind. And it was the only, I think I've said this before somewhere, but it's the only book I can remember finishing both of them and immediately starting it over again, because I was so compelled by not just the narrative he tells, which for an atheist non-theologian, it's amazing what he gets right, especially writing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with much more limited source material and those things. He gets so much right, but his prose is also incredible. Same thing with Edmund Morgan and some other people around that period. And historians don't write that way anymore. So I was just enthralled with the work and how good it was, but then also the subject matter. And I had by that point done kind of the Banner of Truth tour, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Reading all the things that they were putting out at the time, which is heavy on devotional material, I would say, or
Right.
or maybe just purely theological commentaries, that sort of thing, which is great. And that was those works, were very, especially Thomas Watson, Richard Sibbes, and some of these very beneficial to me personally, just as works of devotion and kind of companions for your Bible study. But it was historically having kind of my historical imagination awakened, I guess you might say, was Perry Miller writing on the New England Puritans. And then I just started reading as much as I could on the topic. And again, even as much bad material that came out of that same period, because Miller really got everyone excited about him again and interested. So there's some bad stuff, very liberal stuff from the period. But again, what is mistaken about some of those works is made up for in their prose and their kind of enthusiasm for their subjects. So then from there, I started working much more diligently. Probably by the time I was getting to grad school, on primary source material, and that has continued to hold my interest. And I think sorry to drone on here, but the thing that interests me most, maybe about the Puritans in New England, is there's a perennial problem in Puritan studies with definition of like what is Puritanism, and isms are always that way. But the way I conceive of it, at least in New England, and this is influenced by Miller, though it's not all he would say about them, is as a I think of Puritanism in New England as a socio-political project, and that's how you determine when it begins and when it ends, and which people are Puritans and which are not. This is why I would say Jonathan Edwards is not a Puritan. He's a Congregationalist minister in 18th century Massachusetts. He's not a Puritan, right? Um, that aspect of them is what has continued to hold my interest, is their model for society, their localism, their communal life, their legal thinking, all those sorts of things, has continued to hold my interest, and that's probably what I write most on about them.
Well, I know. I mean, so you've introduced a lot, and I think for most guys, so I'm 40, and a lot of the young, restless, reformed type, which I proudly claim to not have been a part of at any point in my life, but coming into Calvinism, many read the Puritans because they were
Mm-hmm.
touted by Mark Dever and John Piper and others. So they were talked about, but again, it was only their inner spirituality focused,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was very interesting to see that these people were they did actually have a life outside of their personal quiet time.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, that is an important and missing element for many. And the number of people I've read who've cited them as good examples is striking. I think probably Christopher Lash, I remember years ago in, oh boy, I think The True and Only Heaven. I think that was
Mm-hmm.
the book that he refers to them positively as good examples of people who knew how to conserve. And of course, Marilyn Robinson, who there's plenty of we could say a lot about Marilyn Robinson, but she doesn't blast the Puritans. She speaks with a degree of warmth that is uncommon. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, it is for a long time they were simply pushed aside, and it was they acted like people acted like, well, we don't want to claim them, but now it seems like there are at least some, probably still contrarians, but some who do appreciate them. So let's take another, what could be a very broad question. But why did the Puritans come to the American colonies? Or
Mm-hmm.
why did they leave?
Yes. So this may be somewhat of what you're getting at or referring to. The common, I think, narrative that most people hold, whatever we can call this, the high school kind of textbook level narrative, if you like, the would begin with the separatists of Plymouth, who are to be distinguished from who settle 10 years later in 1630 in Massachusetts Bay, and a couple years before that in Salem, and then on to Connecticut and New Haven and on around. Um, so usually the narrative usually begins with the Pilgrims, as they're usually called now, and the narrative is basically one of religious liberty, of a persecuted people fleeing tyranny, to come and establish. Basically, to come and establish what ends up being Rhode Island, and that's Rhode Island is kind of made to be the narrative of all of it. Um, and I don't believe that's the case with Plymouth, and it's certainly not the case with Massachusetts Bay. Um, Certainly, so Perry Miller, which by the way, Marilyn Robinson studied with Perry Miller, so that's part of
Hmm.
the her interest there. Um, And lots of people did, that were influenced by Miller. He had his biggest influence might be getting, the city on the hill references into, it's not till after Miller repopularizes Winthrop's sermon that you start seeing it quoted from JFK on. Everyone,
Right.
I don't know if Trump did, but Obama did, and everyone in between. Um, in speeches, Reagan probably most famously, for conservatives. So he really did put it back into the popular imagination, and you see a lot more interaction. Um, and the same is for, for Christians. And so this narrative starts taking on a lot of importance of what is it about. And we see that generally, with things like the 1619 Project, there's a lot more. The so-called history wars have been something that have occupied not just historians, but cultural commentators and the like for, especially the past 5 years and maybe the past decade. And the Puritans are a part of that. So, Christians are interested, and usually it's this religious liberty narrative. Um, Certainly in Massachusetts Bay, I think Miller says the reason he begins with them is they're the first politically self-conscious settlers or colonists, in America. That 1607, Jamestown is a disaster. There's these little fishing villages up and down the coast that throughout the that same few decades, early first decades of the 17th century, that are purely economic enterprises, outposts. In some ways, Salem was originally something like that. Not sure to be successful. And Plymouth is, if you read William Bradford's journal, I mean, it's a struggle for them to even get off the ground to get here. It's very sad, and they get here, and it's not all that important actually. Massachusetts Bay, Winthrop comes over with 1,000-person fleet and with very influential, educated, and materially wealthy people, with a lot of backing and some good political and legal maneuvering to get their uh, center of control, their headquarters, not tied to London. Right, they can move it around. That's someone leaves that out of the charter. And so they come to establish a government in many ways, even though it starts out with the model, the organization of a corporation. Um, they come to establish a society in their own image, in the way that they want to. So it's not for everybody, and this is borne out by the comments from Puritan patriarchs themselves. So there's by the 1680s, there's a lot more immigration, and there's new sects that are arriving, that are dissenting groups, Quakers, Anabaptists, all kinds of things. And there's specifically in 1680s, maybe 81 or 85, there's a group of Anabaptists from Charlestown that start publishing in print this kind of idea that the founders of Massachusetts Bay, Richard Mather, John Winthrop, all these people, it was all about religious liberty, and they're being denied the franchise, and this is unfair, and it's incongruent with the founding. And the church leaders, specifically Samuel Willard, quickly disabuses them of this idea that it was for toleration or anything like that. This is, as Nathaniel Ward wrote the most famously, the body of liberties for Massachusetts in 1641, said, they have all the religious liberty in the world to go elsewhere. This is basically their view of what they're doing. So the idea is to come and establish a well-ordered, coherent and cohesive socio-political order, both in church and state, that they will, in many ways, they do have these eschatological expectations, but even those are exaggerated in the way they actually thought about it. I think their main goals were actually short term, which was to act as a sort of counter model to maybe Scottish Presbyterianism in Scotland, or just there weren't that many alternatives in England at the time, but it's very clear that there's instability and things may be up for grabs. They're going to go and provide an example of what is to be done, and in the meantime, they want to be generally left alone so they can do things the way they want, and that's what gets them in trouble later. But um, so they come to America, they come to Massachusetts to establish a particular vision of society that is not um, a free for all, and it's not welcoming to everyone. I don't think it would be fairly described as hostile to anyone, but they're very clear about what they're doing, um, and that there's plenty of land for people to go establish societies the way they want to,
They
but they're
were
not going to be
not.
deterred.
Pardon me for interrupting. So
No, no,
what I hear you say is they were not a liberal society.
yeah,
In fact, they were purposefully illiberal, or we
yeah,
might even say conservative. With a
yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that's right. If you're familiar with Gillis Harp's really good new book, uh, Protestantism and American Conservatism, something like that.
Right.
Really good. His chapter in there. I mean, he's not a and doesn't claim to be a New England expert, and it's a survey. It's a sweeping book. But his chapter on New England is really good, and he includes them in this. Is good at describing them, fairly briskly, but I think in a fair way of what they're doing. And so they are, they're seeking, of course, as Puritans to purify the fully reform the English Church. This is why they maintain this legal fiction that they never separate from the Church of England, and they come up with theories from William Ames that this is what actually in the beginning the Church of England was polity wise. Um, this whole thing. So they don't want to separate. What they want to do is reform. Which if you're a sort of a Burkean conservative, you're going to recognize a necessity for organisms to be conserved have to grow and also
Right.
be chastened, you might say, or whatever. So yeah, they're certainly not. I think it is fair to say there's not a liberal bone in their body. It's an anachronistic thing to analyze them this way, but for our purposes, I think it's fair to say that any kind of Whiggish history that treats them as the forebears or the sort of proto liberal or proto Democrats or whatever you want to say, they're often employed in this way to present a sort of seamless narrative from the 16th or the 17th century to the present of exactly what we are was in seed form in New England in 1630 is there's no basis for that. That's just not how they think about anything. The as there's a really good book called Peaceable Kingdoms by Michael Zuckerman that goes all the way up through the 18th century describing township life in New England. And he just discusses how their general political disposition is one of um, minimizing difference. Difference is bad. They don't want pluralism. They don't want what we'd call now multiculturalism. They're all basically from the same county in England, most of them, at least at the beginning. They're all of the same. They're supposed to be there for the same religious convictions. They think it's necessary for a healthy polity, a healthy society, to have as little disagreement as possible. Well, this is a fundamentally illiberal approach to society to
Right.
eradicate at every turn, not necessarily violently, but disagreement on any level. They want homogeneity, and because they want homogeneity because it provides peace. That's what would be their supreme political value at the ground level. Um, so this, yeah, I think this is a very illiberal society, and that's not even getting into what they actually do with dissenters and these sort of things that won't kind of conform. Um, I doubt most people who now go to Harvard would have enjoyed Harvard 400 years ago. So um,
Right.
yeah, I would agree with that assessment.
So that there's a couple of ways actually to
Mm,
take this, but one that I found in your writing that has really intrigued me, talking about their emphasis on conformity.
mhm,
Well, for one thing, just by observation, their descendants have remained so. I mean, if there is a region of the United States that is more uh, homogenous than
mm,
anywhere else, it's probably New England, especially the rural areas of New
yeah,
England. You
yeah,
will see the same type of people, and so,
mhm,
but in some of what I've read from you before, you've talked about their medieval inclinations, not just
Mhm.
inclinations, but that they were a truly pre-modern people, whereas they're depicted now, like when you look at the English Civil War, as trying to bring in, the Puritan side. People say they were trying to bring in modern republicanism and
Yeah.
again Whiggish historical view. Whereas with what I have read from you and from others, that was not the New England Puritans.
Mm.
That they were trying to have a society that would look something closer to England in the year 1000 than
Mm.
England in the than anything it looked like in the 1800s.
Yeah. So they're certainly very, they provide lots of social commentary, and their sermons sometimes do this, but they're very of course shocked or horrified by the state of England, especially in the cities, and they're not as dour and all of that as people present them to be, but they're also not, they would have similar commentary we might have today of, they will critique, sort of materialism, chasing fashion, all these sorts of things that um, we're still tempted by and might define our cultures just in the extreme now, we might say. But um, so they're very concerned with that, and they don't desire to have that imported to what they're trying to build. And what they do want is, somewhat like you said, they're very interested in building these sort of homogenous communities that are centered on shared religion and high levels of accountability, really up in your business. We might say. Um, a very localized form of or involvement in politics, but at the same time, um, willingness to afford a lot of leeway or deference to their rulers, both in church and state. So you do have this aspect of congregationalism, where of course there's a large or a higher degree of lay participation, but once the rulers are in place, once the elders are in place, at that point, then it's over. You don't have this ability to rescind the offer at will. um, the Even the New England Puritans also, underappreciated aspect of them as Congregationalists, which is a problem for Baptists in some ways, is the New Englanders have a very high view of synodical authority, even. And Increase Mather has these comments, um, where he basically says, there's no real option besides to conform to what the Synod determines, even though it doesn't function like the SBC. We'll say that. That's not what they're doing out there. So in that way, some very traditional pathologies, or maybe a traditional disposition, things I've commented on, I know, on in the past, in terms of their, what I will call their medieval, uh, character, is, on the one hand, David Hall points this out in one of his works. Very good Puritan scholar for the most part. That their sort of spirituality, um, and cosmology and these things are still fundamentally medieval. Um,
Worlds of Wonder.
that's
That
right.
book.
That's right. Yep, very good book. Talk some of that about that in there, um, and so there, you have their communal life. We would say it's not modern looking. The way they're running their towns, it's not modern looking for the time. It doesn't, they all spend a lot of time in the Netherlands, or many of them do, Leiden and Amsterdam, so on. But it doesn't look like those cities. They're building very, very communal and older style societies. Um, and their experience of town life would have been a lot more like what medieval people would have experienced. So if you read, good biographies of Luther, that will give you some kind of background commentary on, um, the at that time, the rise of what we'd now say a middle class and technological change. But for most people, they're very rural. You never leave your town. This kind of thing. Um, that's a lot more their experience, and some of that is just geography. Where they are. I would say that their location at that time has a great effect on them as people in this way. So you've transported yourself into a new range of possibilities because it's unpopulated or because you don't have anything developed. So you're able to, for better or worse. But the other thing that I know I've referred to them as being fundamentally medieval would be in their political theory, um, and I think this is uh, somewhat true of Reformed Orthodoxy at the time generally. I don't think this is being been discarded, on the other side of the pond either at the time for the most part. There's certainly, as you know, in the English Civil War period, there's some crazy stuff that emerges and goes on. But in general, the reformers still have very uh, traditional views of church and state. The adjustments that are made are to deal with papal authority, and I think to hurdle back over late medieval innovations about political theory that come really from maybe Pope Boniface onward, and are kind of doing what they do with many doctrines, which is to get back behind, the bad schoolmen or late medieval changes that were maybe for expedience sake or what have you, and they're wanting to recover older things. And so the Puritans are like, are obviously part of Reformed Orthodoxy and embody that. And so they're, what I'll say that is medieval about them in this way is I think they are working out and established the older understanding of church state interaction as analogous to the human person in body and soul, and that these things must be in harmony and must not simply coexist, and certainly don't have a relationship of antagonism, but need to be provide mutual help and are ultimately ordered to the same final end, which is the glory of God. And so they write a lot about the magistrate's religious interest. So do other Protestant reformers, magisterial reformers. Vermigli does this, Richard Hooker does this, Zwingli, Calvin, and do this, lots of others. So but they do this as well, and I've written on their election sermons that they provide every year, is where you find a lot of this talk from them, and they're very, very good and refreshing in that way. Um, but they're not thinking like modern people about church and state or authority in general. Just because you have decided that papal authority is illegitimate doesn't mean you've cast off your fundamental conceptions of what authority is, where it comes from, and what it's supposed to do.
Right. I know that's a standard trope of many,
Yeah.
that once the Reformation started, then there was no source of authority. So
Yeah, this is Brad Gregory or whoever you want to
right,
pick. Right.
right. All of those guys. It's just that they say Pandora's box was opened, and so no one actually maintains authority. And of course, you can push back and say, well, we don't. I mean, it's not really clear that the priests in early 16th century Europe were exactly paragons of virtue, either inner or outward virtue. So I mean,
Yeah.
which is worse? Diverging from the Pope, his authority on what happens at the Eucharist, or from diverging from the traditional Decalogue of "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Which one actually is the worst thing? So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is, people forget the very proximate, in terms of historically proximate, not experientially for the people on the ground, but it's still, there's a long, um, there's this period between the conciliar crisis, you might call it, from Constance onward, that is sort of this fizzling, or maybe you'd call it boiling. It's up and down. Um, and to the extent that there's something like the Reformation going to happen, there's already talk about reform and these things from Erasmus or whomever way before Luther. Technological changes also make this somewhat inevitable, that the democratization of information and these sorts of things are going to change concepts, or at least function, of authority. So in some ways, and this is not unique to me at all, but you could say that the Protestant Reformation is the triumph of conciliarism from the late medieval period, from whoever you want to pick up on, Marsilius of Padua and Nicholas of Q, and some of these figures that are writing in the 15th century and before, 14th 15th century, about modes and styles of authority, and maybe that the real authority should be council based because it comes from the body of the faithful, and these sorts of things. So these were not new questions, and in some ways, because the church didn't deal with them properly a couple hundred years before Luther, they could have prevented such an explosive reformation, we might say,
Right.
if they really wanted to, if they'd had the will to do so. And this is, some of this is self-consciously acknowledged and furthered by the Reformed Orthodox in the 17th century. If you read Lex Rex from Rutherford, he cites multiple conciliarist councils, including the Council of Basel is always a big one for Reformed people that they think is important, and it was not acknowledged by the papacy, right? That's part of the point, is why they cite it. But it was a legitimate council of bishops, and so they will cite these things. They also cite more immediate precursors, both in and out of England, like John Mayer and some of these political theorists that were questioning styles of authority. So it wasn't like this came out of the blue, and it wasn't like the opinions of the reformers were so outlandish as I
Right.
think some Catholic historians today treat it as. This was a long kind of process that all of a sudden happened really fast. Um,
Heiko
and then they
Obermann
also,
does a lot
yeah, yep,
on
Harvest of
all
Medieval
that.
Theology. That's right. Very good. Obermann's book, both on Beale and on Luther, Man Between God and the Devil, are both must reads. Very helpful in the medieval background and understanding the reformers through that. So, I always take those critiques from modern Catholics as being a bit unserious and not really dealing with history so much as they're dealing with polemics with a historical kind of. In many ways, what we're talking about, it happens with the Puritans. There are certain events are put in service of current positions. Um,
Right.
and so I don't, not that Brad Gregory is a, stupid person. He's a very learned man, but I think
Right.
that I found that his position to be remarkably uncompelling. So
It's an easy jump to make when you have an axe already there to grind.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
and
that's
he's
right.
not going to get a lot of pushback from fellow Roman Catholics on that position.
Right,
So,
right. No, he's going to get no pushback, and in some ways, many Protestants, kind of go along with it because they actually have a um, more of a liberal disposition on many things. So if this
right.
radical break happens, then you're freed up to move briskly along rather than wrestle with your own tradition or what it means. So I think there's two things going on there. One's intended by Gregory and one's not, but it's a very obvious externality of what he's done. And it's not just him, of course, but
Right.
picking on
Right.
him.
Well, but because the unintended Reformation is cited by so many, both Protestant
Yes.
and Catholic, you
Yeah.
can't avoid the arguments there.
Yes.
So, but speaking, were you about to say something else?
No. 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 Go ahead.
Speaking of the Puritans and how they are cited for whatever one's pet cause is, Max Weber
Hmm.
and his view of Calvinist and capitalism, that
Hmm.
has a lot of traction in certainly in textbooks. So I taught public school history for 15 years. So
Hmm.
that's still to this day a prime emphasis in high school history.
Yeah.
That's and also the first couple of the undergraduate history classes, it's still taught. So so we hear that the Puritans were free market, almost libertarian capitalists,
Hmm.
and so it doesn't sound like, though, from what you've said here, their perspective on society does not jive very well with modern free market capitalism the way we know it.
Yeah, I would say, they're generally averse to the free market, both in speech and ideas, as well as material goods. They're not interested in, sort of setting up a Jeffersonian uh, rules of the game and then letting it play out, each according to his own relative industry. And fair's fair. Let's just, whatever happens is good. It's an effect of the market, whether that's morally and intellectually or materially. So I don't think they're interested in that at all. They're very, as I've said before, their view of what society, how society is, how it functions, and what it is still very organic. And this is part of their medieval disposition. So if society is an organism, and you get this some of this flair, even from Winthrop's sermon we already brought up, the model of Christian charity. Um, each part is working together. He's of course pulling from Paul, but each part is working together. Each part is not greater than the whole, and each the whole works for the ultimate good of each part, but not separate from the other parts. So there's no, man is never an island. There's no such thing as a state of nature where you have a possibility of existing apart from a community. um, Man is, it's not good that he should be alone, right? So man is communal. And you see this not only in their kind of comments on political theory, but even their laws. So for instance, young men, or anybody, certainly young women, but young men were not allowed to live as bachelors. They either had to get married or live with a family. That was enforced.
Hmm.
The idea is you don't have, not only will they have funny, things they say about young men being prone to vice and shouldn't be left alone, but the idea is you need to be participating in society. So this doesn't mean, of course, that they weren't trading or that they weren't somewhat
Right.
industrious. You would have to be in the, the wilderness, or that they're not interested in having their businesses and their farms and all this be profitable. That's not, but that doesn't make that's not enough. It's not sufficient for, the Weberian thesis just to be people who engage in economy. Um, their interest is a, you know godly and cohesive and peaceable society, and this is involves every aspect. So um, nothing can sort of become disordered or disproportionately prioritized. So there's a great example in I'm going to forget the year, but still mid 17th century, where a man who is from Ipswich, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston, now Essex area, he he is missing church too much. And his excuse is that he has to tend to his farm and it's too far away from church, the church house, to make it all the time. And this is, of course, a good excuse because if you're in an agrarian, largely agrarian society, if the cows get out, you have to tend to them. So they're very understanding of that. Their solution from the general court is to make him sell his land and buy a farm that's closer to church, because therefore the excuse is gone and you can't. So easy fix. We'll find you a good farm that's comparable. You still need to make a living, but now if the cows get out, you can still make it to, to service, or people can help you. So that would be an example of the economic being subservient to larger aspects of social, political, and religious life that are prioritized even to um, someone's detriment, certainly to the detriment of their choice in a libertarian free market kind of way. So I don't think it would ever be fair to call. I think something Weber and to some extent Tocqueville later pick up on is a large amount of activity and a large amount of work and dedication, but they miss in some ways. Tocqueville does better than Weber, but miss the rationale and the conviction behind it, and the purpose.
Right. So, I mean, but that perspective on I mean, of course, they all knew that man's chief end was to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But we have individualized that to the degree that really that's for us modern Americans, that's between you and your conscience.
Yeah.
How you glorify God. As long as you're not overtly breaking the Decalogue,
Hmm.
then we're not going to say anything. But it sounds, for what you're saying, for them, they believe that there was a particular way, and that we were called to glorify God, and that it was their job as a civil society to help through the
Hmm.
use of the law and judgment to help her members glorify God.
No, that's exactly right, and I think a very important point about um, our own understanding of the function and purpose of law. You could say policy too, whatever. Generally, I think it's how it always functions, but you have to um, both embrace that and do it self consciously. So what I mean by that is, this is a generally this isn't a Puritan conviction. This is a generally Christian conviction going back, at least to Thomas Aquinas, who says, the purpose of law and of government, of rule, is to lead men to virtue. That's the point of it. So it's not just a lamentable and necessary evil that we have authority on earth. It's actually a good, and the both Western Christians generally, but just to stick with our Protestant brethren, go beyond that, as Aquinas did as well, where you have um, authorities like Franciscus Junius, um, Richard Baxter, um, Vermeely, who already mentioned, Hooker already mentioned, all these people that we'll read, and others besides, that would say it's actually because man is body and soul, as we talked about earlier, and the magistrate rules over men, and he doesn't rule over just animals. They have more than a temporal interest, and they have an eternal one. And if his job is to rule for their good, in some way, it's his job to lead them, to God. Now, he doesn't have the legislative or direct competency to promulgate doctrine. So what that ends up looking like is leading them both by example, promoting and protecting the church, and promulgating and protecting the church's doctrine, so that this is all conducive to man having a virtuous and religious and God honoring life. And that's part of his duty. I was just reading Richard Baxter yesterday in his short letter he wrote to an unnamed magistrate, and he just made this comment. He made all these about the magistrate needs to lead people to virtue. And one thing he points out is you if you have a prayerless household as a magistrate, you're going to lack integrity. You're going to make poor decisions, and you're going to tell everyone else that it's okay to be profane. So this is like how much they think the microscope is on leaders and how much they need to lead by example. But then also in their law, you can't blaspheme. You can't lead people. They still hold to the view that murder kills the body, but both apostates and heretics kill souls. So that's worse. So this is why we
Mhm.
punish these things. In New England, they're fairly lenient by standards of the day. The most often exercised punishment for obstinate promulgation, open, declaration of false doctrine, or challenging of authority is banishment, which is just to leave, and then you can't come back. They only ever exercise anything more severe when the banishment instructions are not abided by, right? So
Right.
this is the view is not to put a gun to anyone's head to force them to convert. This is a very typical evangelical mistake. Is if you start talking about any kind of coercion, it means forced conversion, and
Right.
that's not what we're talking about. But conditions, material conditions, especially our laws and our policies, and then our cultural signals or indicators, are always coercive unto some kind of virtue, some kind of orthodoxy. And the Puritans were very aware of this, and did so self-consciously and on purpose, because they think it's what society does, and it's the proper function for leaders in church and state to do. So it's not a passive rule, and they also don't think that it's good to leave men to their own devices. They need to be guided, you know, gently, but also firmly to what is true. And so this is why you have Franciscus Junius saying, it's the in his Mosaic polity, it's the magistrate's job to lead his people to the gates of eternal salvation, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but he says the gates, of eternal salvation, and he does this through proper relationship with the church. But he's saying, this is on you. You'll be judged by where you lead your people, what kind of virtue you lead them to. And the Puritans in New England thought the same way about things.
That sounds very so. When you're talking,
Mm,
you've referenced virtue several times.
yeah.
That itself is a very Thomistic and
Mm,
going back Aristotelian view of man that
yeah.
is largely lost. But then it also, and I'm not saying that the two are the same, but it reminds me a lot of Andrew Willard Jones' work on
Mm-hmm.
church and state.
Mm-hmm.
What was he had the book on the King of
Before the church
France.
and state.
Right, right. So that, I mean, and he's done a lot of, Roman Catholic though he is, he's done a lot of good work of bringing forth this perspective as a Roman Catholic. But it sounds like that the Puritans are just they're on the same mountain and together. I mean, it's the same medieval view, I guess, of the role of society in helping
Yeah.
man to glorify God.
Yeah. It's society is to be formative. In fact, it always is. We just now pretend it's not.
Right.
Um, that way, we don't have to worry ourselves about how it's being formative. But it always is. But they acknowledge that and in fact embrace it and think this is the point of all of it. I mean, and Andrew Willard Jones's work is really good, and I don't think that's as you're saying lost. Um, by the time of the Puritans, or certainly the magisterial reformers. I mean, if you read and get kind of into someone like Zwingli, might be the best on this in his political writings. I mean, it's very clear from him that he has no concept of distinction at all. There's simply the Christian communion that has a distribution of labor, and that's pretty
Right.
much it. There is no real. He doesn't have an idea of what a state would be. This is a um, it comes a century later after him to really have a nation state idea. So you have various forms of power, and you have certain responsibilities. Each of them are given, but they're not so separate that they shouldn't help each other. And you might have someone, John Cotton or John Davenport. It's unclear who wrote it, but very good work in 1663, a discourse about civil government, and it's from New England. Uses a lot of Franciscus Junius and some other continental reformers to talk about church and state are two species of the same genus, and that genus is the Christian community or Christian society, and so they both have their appointed um, function, their appointed competencies, but they have the same author, they have the same source of power, they have the same subjects, which is man. The only thing distinct is their immediate end, which is one is the spiritual, one is the temporal. In a sense, that's what they're more focused on. But ultimately, they have the same final end. Therefore, in between, there's also a lot of overlap, and this is where they will pull for mutual aid to each other and that sort of thing, mutual accountability, the whole bit. So yeah, it's very foreign to us, even at the most basic level that we just started at a few minutes ago, which is just an idea before we even get to church and state that society is formative and that it's meant to as an instrument to lead man to a virtuous life. And of course, even our, you know, read in the best light and in the sort of classical tradition that still influenced them. Even our founders of this country were generally still of that persuasion. I mean, even I would say even Jefferson, is my least favorite after Thomas Paine, still thinks that way for the most part. Um, in many ways, even though I employ him as a trope and to make fun of. There, I think most of them, and then certainly many of the other ones, like us, Samuel Adams, John Adams and George Washington, those guys, and many of the founders we never talk about. They still think this way in general, even if it's a laxer version, a more ecumenical version of a Christian country. They still think this stuff is formative. That's, why else would you pass laws? What else is the point of all this?
Right.
Um, if a higher end than material prosperity is not in view, I think that's a conviction we've lost.
So would you say then? Maybe two questions here, but because both come up at times, there's discussion certainly about the the two kingdoms idea. And of
Hmm.
course, that has about as many definitions as it does proponents. So I
Right.
know it can be difficult. But so the first question, though, is were the Puritans, did they have a distinction between the kingdoms? And
Hmm.
then the next is, would you consider them theonomists? Because certainly modern
Mm.
theonomists say that they are.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so anyway, so how do they match up there?
Yeah. So very rarely, if ever, in as far as I can tell, do you see in the New England Puritans any mention of something approximating two kingdoms as it's generally understood today, or even that language. I just it's hard to find. Um, there's certainly, just as with all Reformed Orthodox of the period, there's an acknowledgement, of course, that there's an invisible realm that is ruled over immediately by Christ, and then there's a physical or temporal realm ruled over mediately by Christ through many things, and Christ is Lord of all, and He should be recognized as such. This is what they mean when they even use the term theocracy. Is not a rule by clergy, but it's just a recognition of Christ's preeminence by everyone. So very basic to them. Um, so the only kind of regime that's not a theocracy is a non-Christian one. Is so that would be their understanding of that term at the time. So there's all of that. But in terms of using as it's often used today, I think two kingdoms is overworked for what it represents, and I'm drawing for this on some good secondary literature on Luther. William Wright is really good on this. Brad Littlejohn's written on this some as well, but where what Luther's doing with the concept is in some ways much more robust. It's much more of a sort of worldview, and he employs it in so many different ways that church and state is almost at the bottom of the list of his concern when he's talking about two kingdoms things. Calvin prefers much different language, but more importantly than the language is Calvin's situating of the church and the state both in the temporal order, in the temporal realm, which means that your two kingdoms, however it exists, and as I've already mentioned, Zwingli, I don't see it there at all. Um, as it exists, it's not meant to correspond to church and state. It's meant to make a very rudimentary, non-controversial point, in my opinion, which is that there's an invisible and visible realm. What it's employed to do today often is to just say this is a heuristic, or these are terms to help us talk about church and state, two kingdoms, and then they'll drive it back to Augustine. I don't think this is how you read the City of God at all, but they'll do this kind of thing. Um, so I find that a very limited utility. I find it much more useful if we're going to talk about church and state, if that's our conversation, um, to speak in older terms that I think the Puritans use, and I think many others did, which is about the spiritual and temporal powers on earth and how those are supposed to relate, and much of what we've already talked about is stemming from that basic approach. So I think that's much more useful. And so I generally critique certainly the version of Two Kingdoms that's coming out of Westminster West,
Right.
and things out there. I find problematic, even though it's presented often as a historical case. I think it's not been demonstrated well, and I don't think it can be. I think the better historical work on the period it moves you in a different direction if you're interested in the church state question. If you're just kind of talking about Luther's commentary on this life and the next, or Christ, resurrected and glorified and in victory and all these things. Yeah, there's those terms are there, and he's doing things, but I think it's misemployed. It's used in the wrong way. It was never meant to carry that kind of burden. Um, to your second point about theonomy, as I've written at several places critiquing theonomy, and we'll have a piece coming out soon about specifically this question with the New England Puritans. Ian Clary has already done a really good job of critiquing theonomy at Mere Orthodoxy, and its attempt to use Puritanism in general. He has a much broader kind of emphasis and focus, and it's a really good article at Miro. It's a review of Joe Boot's book, Mission of God, a bit longer review. So I'm doing something different, which is specifically this New England question, because if you read, Greg Bonson's Theonomy and Christian Ethics, at the end he has an appendix where he includes John Cotton's, they think it was written by John Cotton, maybe not, Abstract of Laws of New England from 1641, probably published a little bit earlier. And uses that and has some comments before a bit of a preface, and wants to claim the New England Puritans as theonomists. Joe Boot does the same thing, and will call himself and Rushdoony and everyone before him New Puritans, and say that they're the best contemporary forebears of Puritanism. Lots of definitional problems when they talk that way and everything, but to try to not fight the hypothetical and answer the question. The main problem with theonomy is their lack of a taxonomy of law that we would recognize generally as a Thomistic taxonomy of law that's carried on by almost everybody. There's always tweaks going on to it, but it stays basically the way Thomas left it, which is to have a category of eternal, natural, divine, meaning inscripturated, and human law, right? And it's a hierarchy, and within the hierarchy, the lower parts can't disagree or conflict with the higher parts. With eternal law being just God's essence and not ascertainable to us, that natural law is eternal law condescended to creatures, so that it's what we know and can know about the eternal law. Divine law is supportive in that it's specifically the Decalogue is a republication of the natural law, and then human law is what we make based on, again, attempting to be in agreement with the natural law and with Scripture, not contradicting those, and in some sense applying those to context, to circumstances that are always changing, and so it takes prudence and it takes knowledge of these things. And so the problem with theonomy is when they look at the Old Testament, at the Mosaic civil and judicial law, um, they have a very, I guess you could say, venerable instinct, which is to take the Bible seriously, to not be embarrassed as a Christian of your ethical posture. And this takes a somewhat biblicist form in them, but nevertheless, the one thing they're wanting to say is, look, I'm not embarrassed that God says this in Leviticus. I'm not embarrassed that in Deuteronomy it says this. That's great. The problem is they don't, at least according to our tradition, it's very strong. I always recommend Junius's Mosaic Polity to people on this, which I've already mentioned, because it addresses this question head on, even before theonomy exists, and others do as well, on how to use the Mosaic Code. And the problem is they don't recognize that law as belonging to the category of human law. And that doesn't mean it is made by humans, although of course it's brought through Moses, so there's a human component there. But it's God stepping in as the legislator, to apply His eternal law through natural law in context to circumstance. And this is why the Westminster Confession in 1904 says that law has departed, or however it puts it, with that polity, because human law is always tied to the circumstance. Now, everyone from Aquinas to Luther and others would say, if there's a particular Mosaic judicial law that fits your context and works really well, you're of course free to use it. There's nothing wrong with them. God said it, but you don't have to. And this is the basic theonomic claim, is that only that model is appropriate for any civil polity, that and no further. I mean, Bonson will even say things like this and this alone. So it's like a scripture alone kind of play. And anyone who thinks otherwise is, not thoroughly Christian. They're not understanding the radical antithesis. They are probably confused by or enchanted by natural law, which all of them reject as being a legitimate authority. And so that's the problem. It's not the problem with theonomist is not. There's a lot of goofiness. That's whatever. We can deal with that a different way. But their problem is they don't actually understand within our tradition, within the Western Christian tradition generally, how to think about law and its modes of promulgation, its ways it comes to us, and its basis for authority. So you will have many, many reformers writing things like, the reason you follow the Decalogue is not because Moses wrote it down. It's not because it's in Scripture. That's not why it's authoritative. It's authoritative because it is an inscripturation of the natural law. That's where its authority is lodged. And Moses is the best exponent of the basics of that. And so you'll have people like Johannes Althusius, the great Calvinist jurist, saying the best way to know the natural law is, of course, Scripture is helpful. Aquinas says the same thing. This helps remind you of and teach you of basic things. It's good to see good laws that reflect the natural law, that teach you what that looks like. And then the teachings of the church. And this is basically what I'm appealing to, is our tradition has an amazing range of works, amazing number of works on questions, this question directly and questions related to it that stem from it. And I think theonomists have just not availed themselves of that, and maybe intentionally so, because they see it as somewhat of a cop-out. And so, to get back to the question of the Puritans, there's nothing that in New England indicates a theonomic understanding of law. Citing Scripture when you present a legal code of some kind is not sufficient to say you're a theonomist. So what the theonomist can't be allowed to do is say the rest of us aren't allowed to appeal to Scripture as a basis of authority for anything. That you have to be all or nothing.
Right.
That can't be. They can't be allowed to do that. But what they'll say, they're very slippery with their terms. Is sometimes theonomy, it appears to just be the interest in living a God-centered life. They'll talk about that with the Puritans. It's like, well, okay, who's objecting to that? And so that's not what theonomy is in terms of its distinctiveness. Or they'll say, a biblically based ethics. It's like, well, this is still very amorphous. What does that mean? And so they'll play around with that with the Puritans and say, look at all this look at their general focus, their orientation, their tenor in society, look at their use of the Bible, their people of the book, all these things. But that's not the theonomic claim. The theonomic claim is the Puritans would have to have said somewhere, and actually done, a direct transcription, importation of the Mosaic civil and judicial code, and lived only by that, and that would be it. And they didn't do that. There's plenty of good works, some of which theonomists like Bonson, will cite, and clearly didn't understand or didn't read the whole work, that make it very clear that this could never be described as a Bible commonwealth, as just being based on the Bible. They're Englishmen. They're bringing in tons of common law stuff, precedent, all these things. In fact, some of the things Bonson criticizes John Cotton on, saying like, he gets really close with this, but here's a problem with him. Well, the problem that Bonson doesn't like is John Cotton basically following the common law rule on a particular punishment.
Right.
So and the issue for the context too is, if you're in the 17th century, the jurists like Matthew Hale have declared that Christianity is part of the common law. So now you're really confused, because from the bench there will be Scripture cited. Well, I don't see any theonomists claiming that 17th century England as a whole was a theonomic country, but
Right.
judges are citing Scripture. So there's more going on there in the intellectual kind of milieu that's so foreign to us, that what theonomists do when they appeal to the Puritans, generally, or certainly in New England, is they're snagging something off the surface that looks like it's agreeable to them, and they're not really understanding what's going on the ground. So the answer is no. The pure very long way of saying Puritans are not theonomists. No one before theonomists have really been theonomist. And anytime they make a historic claim to a sort of mainstream scenario in our history, it's probably wrong. Who would be theonomist would be, Anabaptist in Munster would be maybe theonomist because they're only using the Bible, for any other kind of biblicist instantiation of social interaction would be and those never go well, and they've never really existed. So theonomy in the Reform world is an aberration in this sense, and distinctly modern, and there's simply no real precedent for it. Maybe you can cherry pick things here and there, but it's not sufficient to demonstrate the historic case.
Well, this has been really enlightening and very helpful. I mean, so there's a lot of other questions that I had. Probably don't need to try to get to those because we need to be wrapping up. But if so, I'll say for one, I would love to talk to you again sometime,
That'd
if
be
that
great.
would work. But
Yeah.
if so, last question: what what are two or three at the most lessons that we as Christians could learn right now from our Puritan forefathers?
Hmm.
What are the things that they could teach us
Yeah.
that we really need?
Yeah. I'll cheat some and reiterate some of what we've already said that I do think is really important, which is a reassessment of how we think about um, political order and those types of things. I think that's something that I really have learned a lot from them, that I've written about some because I think it's important and compelling. Um, and we do live in a very interesting little time now where there is a lot of reassessment on many different levels of what's been going on, what's been taken as kind of gospel for a while, what the sacred cows are in political life. And so it's a really good time to look to other models. And if you kind of treat um, historical moments or historical scenarios, I guess you would say, that are not yours, that are older, and treat them almost like going to a foreign country and saying, well, let's see how other people do this. And, remove your stigma that we've talked about earlier about the Puritans and just see, what was this like? There's a really good article from Timothy Breen, who's a great Puritan scholar, and I think Stephen Foster is his co author. It's an older article from maybe the 70s, but what they talk about is New England achieving an unprecedented level um, of really tranquility and social cohesion in their own time period. And while Europe is experiencing tons of war, and while their old country experiences civil war, other than external threats, there's really no problems, and that's incredible. They do it for like 80 years, right? Even for their time period, so it's worth studying. It's worth saying, okay, what is so. This is very interesting because we don't have that now, maybe at any level in our polity. So first would be the political lessons that I think they can be mined for. You don't have to be compelled by all of them, but I think it's a worthy exercise. Um, the second one would be, um, I think, the Puritan, some of the things everyone knows about the Puritans is their love for, of course, the word as good Protestants, their doctrine. But the devotional stuff we've mentioned, I'm not down on that at all. Um, but I'm very compelled also by their actual preaching, which is not read as much. And sometimes it's difficult to get into the sort of Ramist outline logic that they have going on with 60 subpoints of the subpoint type of deal. But once you can get comfortable with it, it's a very so as maybe as rhetoricians is what I would appreciate about them in a time period when rhetoric and speaking was still so highly regarded. So in that way, I think important. If you're a sermon junkie, if you're in seminary, if you're going to be a pastor, they're really good to read. Not that you would, I think Joel Beakey says this all the time, not to actually replicate them, but to let it sharpen your own rhetoric. So caring about the spoken word and thinking about our preaching as being the most important thing in the week. This is Harry Stout's book, The New England Soul. Talks about, it's all on sermons. I thought that that was another great book that really got me excited. And the way they think about their sermons, not just their church life generally, but the sermon itself, was very convicting. Of they're not going to miss this. Their entire life, weekly life, revolves around their preacher bringing the word to them, and then of course lecturing on theology and those sorts of things. So that would be sort of our church life lesson. Is I always want to rehabilitate the sermon, and it's a worthy and unique medium of communication, perhaps now more than ever. I'm not a Luddite. I don't hate technology, but I'm really a fan of being in person for people speaking. That's a weird thing to
Right.
do now, and I think it's different. Not sure what it is, but it's different. So I would say, especially after COVID, that's something. Not that other groups can't teach you that, but the Puritans certainly do, about valuing the sermon, the spoken word, and living life together in person. So those would be
Okay.
my two lessons. Yeah,
Well, I appreciate that. This has been really good, and so I thank you for coming, and you've given us plenty to chew on and think about for a while. So I appreciate it, and I hope we can talk again soon.
absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This was fun. Happy to do it anytime.